Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Transforming R&D with Patients. Our overarching question today is going to be how patients currently contribute to R&D and to clinical development, and how this can be done better. So this will include a discussion evolving around collaborations between patients and companies in pushing forward drug development. And let me just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Ron Jortner. I'm a scientist and founder and managing director of Masthead Biosciences. We're a Cambridge-based company who reviews technology in healthcare. And we have here an excellent panel that we've assembled for you. We have Lachlan Hay from Clinuvel. We have Emily Crossley from Duchenne UK. We have Charles Stewart from Congenica, and we have Andrew Udell from Calliditas, who is joining us from across the puddle. And let me just introduce the topic very, very briefly. So a lot of companies are talking about being patient-centric or patient-focused, but not everyone means the same thing. And over the last years, there's been a lot of discussion on needing to involve patients earlier and earlier in the state of development of treatments. And this has been sort of spearheaded by the field of rare disease, partially because there was just need. First of all, a lot of patients and their families have been driving forward development. And second, because the field is very lean and because margins are small in every possible way, there's just need to be very efficient and for stakeholders to collaborate. And so a lot of the examples we're going to talk about today are from rare disease. Let me just do one technical bit before we go to the panel itself and to our panelists, and that is we are going live, so we can accept questions from you. And please send those questions through the app to Eileen, and she will forward them to me so we can have questions as we go. And also one more thing, if you'd like to respond to anything on social media, please use hashtag onhelix20 to react. And one more note, we are sponsored by the Cambridge Rare Disease Network. So thank you for that. All right, let's begin. And I'd like, first of all, each one of the panelists to please introduce themselves in 1 or 2 minutes and tell us about their background a little bit, about what they do and why they're here, how they're involved in the collaboration between patients and companies. Maybe we could start with you, Lachlan.
Sure, thanks, Ron. My name's Lachlan Hay. I'm the Director of Global Operations for Clinuvel. It's an Australian company, hence the accent. And our focus for the last 15 years has been on developing novel drugs. In particular, we've taken one product, which is now known as Scenesse, from early stage development to approval initially in Europe and subsequently in the US for an ultra-orphan disorder, which is known as erythropoietic protoporphyria, or EPP. It's an adult indication initially, although we are working in pediatrics as well. My role is a little bit of everything in the company. So my background is in communications, and in that role, I've had a lot to do with patients, talking about disease characterization and understanding their stories and how that feeds back into the business. And more recently, working in terms of the commercialization of the product. So working with both regulatory authorities and also payers and discussions there. So that's hopefully something I'll contribute today.
Okay, thank you very much, Lachlan. Andy, why do we hear from you next?
Sure. Thanks, Ron. So hi, everybody. I'm Andy Udell, run commercial at a company called Calliditas Therapeutics. I've had over 20 years of commercial experience. I've worked for both large pharmaceutical companies as well as the last half of my career, mostly small emerging biotech companies. Calliditas Therapeutics is a biopharma based in Stockholm, Sweden, focusing really on novel treatments for orphan diseases focused on really renal and hepatic right now. Our initial lead asset is a product for IgA nephropathy, and it's currently in phase 3. And I was the first commercial and the first person working in the States for the company, the Swedish-based company, and so I've had to be involved with the advocacy groups and really starting to understand this market in the States. So that's how I hope to contribute to this.
Thank you, Andy. Emily, could you tell us about yourself and about Duchenne UK and your work there?
Sure, Ron. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk onto this panel. Yes, so I'm not a scientist by background. I used to be a television correspondent and anchor for Channel 4 News and CNN International. And then one day, completely out of the blue, my eldest son, Eli, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He was 3.5 years old. So it took my husband and I about a year to pick ourselves up off the floor after that devastating diagnosis. And we set up the Duchenne Children's Trust, which is now Duchenne UK. And in 7 years, we've funded over £15 million worth of research, which isn't a lot in big pharma terms, but what we try to do is leverage our knowledge of the disease and our money to go into places that other people wouldn't necessarily fund. So we're funding a trial looking at a repurposed drug called tamoxifen, where we gave seed funding for gene therapy, and we're funding lots of other projects that really will help to accelerate research, and we work very closely with pharma on one particular project, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Thank you very much, Emily. Charlie, could you tell us about your background?
Yes, of course, Ronnie. Thank you for that. And hello, everyone. So I'm the patient advocacy engagement lead at Congenica, who are based on the Wellcome Genome campus near Cambridge. We're a digital health company that explores the causes of rare genomic diseases. So I spent 26.5 years working on the human genome, mostly at the Sanger Institute, which of course is famous for generating around 1/3 of the human genome. And that's where I did my PhD. I also led the initial gene analysis for human chromosome 10. And then I moved to Congenica about 4 years ago. So I've got a lot of experience with the human genome. But I think more importantly, my passion for rare diseases and trying to understand them more comes from the fact that I've got 2 young children with severe neurodevelopmental disorders, and one of whom had a very severe type of epilepsy, a catastrophic form which caused much developmental regression, very similar to the epilepsy that the ex-Prime Minister of United Kingdom, David Cameron's son, had, his little boy Ivan. So I'm driven every day when I get my kids up in the morning and when I put them to bed in the evening to strive for better understanding of genomic disorders and how we might be able to expedite more treatments based upon the underlying genome.
Thank you. Let me go through all of you and ask you the question: what is actually the unique contribution that patients can make to a company? And from your own experience with some examples, Lachlan, can you tell us maybe how you work with patients and what's the unique contribution that they make to your work?
Sure. Particularly in rare diseases, I think you have a situation where that patient experience or patient journey has to be understood very, very early on in the development of a product. And for us, and in terms of our experience, one of the big problems that we had was around the characterization of the disease, whereby you had often quite old scientific research looking at the disease, where a physician might take a bit of an interest in it, or it's a hobby, if you will, write up a paper, and that's largely what you have as a key point of reference. So when you're starting to work in rare diseases, it's about understanding, okay, what exists in this field, but the experts are the patients and their families in understanding not just how does the disease work, but what impact does that have? And from understanding the impact, from understanding the experience that a patient goes through, you can start to think about things like designing clinical trials and having the conversation around, okay, this might be a biomarker, or this might be a point of interest that has come up in a scientific paper, but what's actually relevant to a patient? How is it you can build that into a program? So for us, a big part of our program was looking at quality of life in EPP, which was not particularly well defined. Like so many rare diseases, EPP doesn't have or didn't have its own disease-specific quality of life tool. We were working from lots of different specialties, disease specialties, medical specialties, to see if there was one that fit, and it really didn't. So part of our clinical development journey was to talk with patients and incorporate them in workshop-style discussions to say, what is relevant to you in your disease? What is relevant in terms of the impact of this disease in your quality of life? It's one of the concrete things that we came out at the end of that was to have an EPP-specific qual tool where we could say, okay, this is not perfect, but it's certainly better for us in terms of capturing the lived experience that you have and the impact of the disease on your quality of life, and ultimately, what is the impact of an interventional therapy for you? So I have a feeling we'll hear a few stories like this, because I know that other disorders have had similar experiences, but for us, that was one of the key things. And we've taken that through from phase 2 clinical development, now using that in post-authorization safety studies. And I can talk about that a bit later on.
You've told me that actually many of the clinicians you've interviewed had never seen a patient during a phototoxic attack, and that actually talking to patients gives you that access to that experience, which you cannot get from the clinicians. Is that?
Yeah. EPP is a toxic reaction to visible light. So when these patients expose their skin to visible light, they'll experience edema and a burning sensation underneath their skin. But of course, a patient learns very early on in life, even if they don't know that it's EPP, that there is a relationship between that reaction and exposure to light. And so they withdraw from society. And so for us, we learned very early on that there are phototoxic reactions, but the patients tend not to have them so often because they're withdrawing from society. They're not exposing themselves to the trigger. And that meant that a lot of the experts had never seen a patient during a phototoxic reaction. They may have written it up. They may see patients in their clinic, and larger clinics might have 20 or 30 patients. But they will say, I've been working with this patient group for 20 years, and I've never actually seen a patient. So that lived experience element, never seen a patient go through a reaction. So that lived experience element is really important. It takes the disease out of the shadows.
Okay, thank you. Andy, could you give us some examples of how in your role you engage with patients, and what's the contribution that they make to your work?
Sure. And I agree with a lot of what Lachlan had said and experienced a lot of similar items. I think that the key and the most important thing the patient provides is really their journey, the entire journey. And when you're dealing with an orphan disease in particular, a lot of times when you're commercializing and you get involved, when I joined the company, it's a lot of scientists, and they are they have one perspective. They could be the who's who in the world on a particular disease, but they're not a lot of times day to day with these patients. And so getting that true patient journey, a lot of times you learn later while you're commercializing something, if you don't involve the patients, that there is a disconnect. What sometimes what the physician tells you, people put on a facade in front of the physician, or who knows, they're not always going to communicate completely well with each other. So what we've started to learn more and more is what impact the disease has on the patients. Sometimes it's even the other treatments that they are receiving have negative impacts, and there's anxiety issues. There's a lot of other things, especially when you get diagnosed with a rare disease. As you heard Emily, her world was rocked, and Charlie, I'm sure, as well, that when this stuff starts, it's devastating. And there's a lot of other things that come with this along with the patient journey. So that's what I think. It's really their unique experience, how it differs from the clinicians, is what really the light that they could shed on the development and what's meaningful to them.
Thank you. Emily, you look at this question from the other direction, so from the direction of the patient. What in your experience do patients contribute to R&D? How does the patient contribution help drug development?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the patient voice is absolutely fundamental, and I think the real question is, how do we integrate it meaningfully at the very beginning of drug development? And I remember reading an article about this man whose son he was teaching him how to ride a bike, and he watched him cycle down the hill, and his son got knocked over by a lorry and died in front of the father's eyes. And I couldn't get that story out of my head because it just seemed to me to be like Duchenne. You know, you see your child grow up a little bit, and then you watch them head towards this inexorable end, you know what it's going to be, and the grief somehow, it's there in your life, and you sort of adapt around it. And what I want to express through this anecdote is that I think asking patients for their experience of the disease and their journey is fundamental, but you have to ask in the right way, because patients themselves, without even knowing it, accommodate the devastation of the disease. You know, they say, well, you know, steroids, they keep my son walking for longer, but okay, he won't go through puberty. Okay, he'll have osteoporosis when he's 9. My son's already broken his leg twice and his arm 4 times. But, you know, I accommodate that. But actually, that's not right. That's not acceptable. And I think it was interesting what Andrew said about how there is a disconnect between the clinician-reported story of the disease and the patient's experience of it, but also the fact that industry tends to engage with patients right at the very end of the drug development journey towards commercialization. And to me, this is wrong, because it's not fair to develop a product without really engaging the patient, and then all of a sudden, when you've got to prove that its value to HTA, then come and ask the patients for them to tell you a story that will then justify your story. And I had a very personal experience of this in Duchenne. The first ever drug for Duchenne was given conditional marketing authorization by the EMA in July 2014. It was called Translarna. It didn't help my son, but it helped a small section of boys with Duchenne. And it took 2.5 years for NICE in the UK to make a decision about whether to reimburse this drug or not. Now, the problem with that delay was that the label on the drug said that you could take it from the age of 5 until you lost ambulation, which is around the age of 11 or 12. So you had families in the UK celebrating when this drug was approved, only to watch their sons stop walking and have that door of hope slam shut in their face. And at that moment, I realized there was something far worse than having no treatment for your child. And that is having treatment that has been proved as safe and effective, but it's locked away in a cupboard because no one can work out how to pay for it, because it was very hard to prove value. So rather than, so I found myself standing outside number 10 Downing Street with a placard shouting for approval for this drug. And I realized that this was a complete waste of my time and everyone else's. And, you know, patients' time is the least thing you can wait, you know, when they're looking after disabled children. You know, our time is very, very precious and in need. So I met this mum whose son also had Duchenne, and she happened to run health value outcomes at GSK. And she said to me, I think there's a more intelligent way for us to do this. So we came up with this idea called Project Hercules, which is now an award-winning global collaboration made up of 9 pharmaceutical companies, many patient organizations across the world, and some of the world's leading HTA and health economists. And the idea behind Hercules is to develop a disease-specific level of evidence that can be used by any company. So it's product agnostic. It can be used for any product that targets any area with the disease, so pulmonary, cardiac, muscle regeneration, gene therapy. So we've developed a natural history model. We've done the biggest ever analysis of all natural history data in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we've developed a new natural history model which threw up some very interesting new findings, which really reflected the patient journey much more than the typical natural history model did. We're in the process of finalising a new burden of illness study, which again had been done before, but hadn't truly captured the cost to the patient of Duchenne and to society. And then we've actually developed and are now in the process of translating our new quality of life metric, because we felt that the EQ5D, and we did a lot of research on this, just wasn't appropriate for DMD. The physical questions didn't account for varying stages of disability. There was very few questions, there was very few information on it about social exclusion, which is a big factor in quality of life in Duchenne. So we called it the DMD Qual. Oxford University Innovations are now hosting it, and we're translating it at the moment. So we feel that this body of evidence is really key to helping companies prepare for HTA. But more importantly, from my perspective as a patient, it means that patients won't be called upon at the 11th hour, because their experiences have already been embedded into the outputs. Their experiences have described the natural history model. Their experiences have described the DMD qual and the burden of illness. So that when we do come to HTA, the patient story really is the icing on the cake, if you like, and our experiences are embedded all the way through. So I feel like Project Hercules offers a paradigm shift in the way that companies engage with HTA, and actually has helped us to improve our understanding of the disease, and I hope will create more equitable trial protocols and make the community work together on more things, not just the reimbursement issue, which is, you know, the final but arguably one of the most challenging hurdles in drug development.
Mm-hmm. So Project Hercules is largely considered sort of a poster child of how collaboration between industry and patients should work. Are there other examples for other diseases where something like this is happening, or has anyone come to you to learn how to do this? I mean, you're saying nine pharma companies, including some of the largest ones, are just working together to pool an effort to get over the hurdle of HTA. So this is something that should be done in other cases too, right?
Well, yeah, it should be done because it's non-competitive. It's about creating disease level evidence. You know, as I said, it's product agnostic. And I think there were three reasons why it was so successful, really. I think firstly, because Duchenne UK very much wanted it to happen, and we invested a lot of money up front to make it happen. Secondly, we had Fleur, who, as she describes herself, has the heart of a DMD mother. Her son is 16 now. So she's lived the disease, but she also has the head of the health economist, because she ran health early outcomes at GSK. She now works for Sanofi. So we had her. And then the third reason why we made it work was because we brought in Josie Godfrey to project manage and give strategic direction to the program. And she actually set up the highly specialized technologies appraisal system at NICE. So she could see it from the other side of the fence, if you like. And she's been absolutely invaluable. And finally, I would like to thank our pharmaceutical partners, you know, Pfizer, Roche. We've got some disease-specific companies, Sarepta, Santhera. You know, we're very grateful to them because they did take a leap of faith by embarking on this project with us. It had never been done before, but I think it's absolutely vital. And if you can persuade companies that it's a non-competitive endeavor, then, and if you have a patient organization who really does understand the challenges of HTA and where the evidence gaps are, then I think, I think it needs to happen. It's going to save huge amounts of time and also money as well. Don't forget that a lot of these small companies in rare diseases put all of their efforts into climbing what I call that first mountain, the mountain of proving your drug is safe and effective. And then all of a sudden there's this other mountain to prove the quality, how much value it offers. And what we're doing, I feel, with Hercules is trying to build a path together up that mountain to make it easier for these smaller companies. And it's been a very iterative process all the way along. You know, we've had really fundamental feedback from all of our industry partners. And, because it was led by a patient organization, we had the buy-in and the support of the patients. So we've really, because Fleur and I are both mothers, we sense check everything that happens. And we had really in-depth full day meetings, full day advisory boards with patients to really embed their experience in everything that we've done.
Thank you, Emily. Charlie, the same question to you, and you come at this from two angles. You are a parent to patients, and you are at a company. So you're in a very unique position to give us these two angles of what actually patient input contributes to the company's work.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Well, thankfully, it is a pretty rare situation to be in, and in some respects, being a scientist and a parent is sort of a curse as well as a blessing, because you tend to, you tend to sort of know a lot of clinicians, and then you tend to be able to sort of read all about the scientific literature, and the world can become a very dark place. So as a scientist, Congenica, we look at rare diseases in general. So typically the figure that's quoted is around 7,000 rare diseases, but I think at a recent Nature publication a couple of weeks ago, they're actually talking a bit to be around the 10,000 rare diseases. You know, and 1 in 17 people will have a rare disease during their lifetime. So which makes it collectively a very common, they become a very common disorder. So I think my point here is that it's very difficult for anybody to be a specialist in every rare disease. So for example, a pediatric neurologist may have to know about 700, 800, 900, maybe 1,000 different neurological disorders. And there's just no way that they can be experts in every single of those fields. Now, if you take a person who's been affected by a terrible rare disease, it's amazing how quickly they become a world-leading authority on their disorder. And there's a sort of a wealth, a treasure trove of information that these people generate. And you only have to look at sort of some of the disease-specific groups and to see what they put together and how they bring together scientists and world-leading authorities to help them push their quest to learn more about their disease. And from the Congenica point of view, what we do is we try to support these groups. I talk about one group in specifically, and that's the Ring 20 group, which is a type of epilepsy that's caused by a serious malformation of chromosome 20, where instead of, as you might typically see in a cartoon, a chromosome sort of like an X shape or a line, the two ends sort of join together to make a ring. So the whole chromosome is essentially affected. And there is very little knowledge about this. There are 1 or 2 experts in the field, in the world.
There's 120 patients around the world or so, aren't there?
Absolutely. But the thing is, and this is what I think is striking, is that the ring chromosome formations can only really be spotted using old-fashioned karyotyping when you look down a microscope. And the new techniques, the new technologies, the next generation sequencing technologies that are now currently sort of exploding in their use, they cannot pick this up. They just cannot pick this up. So that means if working with the Ring 20 group, we actually see over a sort of period of time, the number of people who are diagnosed with the disorder drops as the amount of next generation sequencing occurs. So this means that we need to find new technologies for the patients, and the patients to help understand their to help diagnose them based upon these ring chromosomes, because we believe there are many more people out there who not yet had a diagnosis. And this is what the patient group is doing. They brought together a wealth of people, including Illumina, including us at Congenica, including some of the biggest names in epilepsy and genomic medicine around the world. And with that, we think we have the power to effectively approach the FDA once we've got a little bit more information, to perhaps request drugs used for epilepsy which are not currently allowed to be used for Ring 20. So I think from some respects that's sort of a picture of both of what I think as a patient, and also what Congenica does. But the patient is, dare I say it, before lockdown, I was involved in a roundtable discussion with a national genome study. They were looking to set something up, and we spent a long time talking. And when the document first came through to me to read it, I was aghast. It's like 6 pages long, and there wasn't one mention of the patient in the document. So I wrote back and said, look, you're coming at this from completely the wrong angle. You know, the patient has to be at the center, and you have to build everything around that. And thankfully, they changed the contents of that paper. But taking the lead from the UK 100,000 Genomes Project, that's what they did from the very, very beginning. They put the patient at the very center of everything they do. And in fact, I sit on the patient participant panel, and we have a huge amount of power to essentially veto projects that people might bring to us and say, we would like to use the 100,000 genomes data. We want to develop an app that helps with your medical notes. And we will say, well, that sounds like a great idea. Tell us more. And then we're told more. And then in the end, we say, actually, no, this sounds a little bit like just data mining to to help you build something that might sell well. So I think the 100,000 genomes is an excellent example of where patient centricity, as you recently called it, is key to developing a successful project.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a little bit later, if we get to it, about something about the 100,000 genome as well, and your involvement in the patient panel. Okay, up to the next question. For a business, what does it actually mean? What does it actually translate to be patient focused? What does it actually mean? Because everyone uses this word. Lachlan, maybe you could tell us.
Well, I'm slightly cynical when I hear phrases like this, because it looks really good on a website to say we're patient-centric and patient-focused, but when it comes down to it, quite often that's not the case. I think for us, in terms of our journey, and I hear a little bit of this in terms of what both Emily and Charlie have raised, it's about trying to identify those patients who are capable of talking about their experiences and really verbalizing what it is that they've gone through. Sometimes that's a patient, sometimes it's a parent, and being able to capture that as part of your thinking as an organization. It's not just about saying, well, this is how they experience their disease and we'll put that into a clinical trial. It's about evolving that thought process such that you can develop a treatment and get that treatment to the patient. And for us, that's an entire end-to-end thought process. And it speaks a little bit to what Emily mentioned, which is you need to involve patients along the whole process, and really make that not so much centric, but it's just something that has to be fundamental to the DNA of the business. I don't know if that quite answers your question, to be honest, Ron, but it's a different way of thinking about I'm developing a drug. It's I'm developing something for this group of people. And this is their lived experience, and this is how I think I can address that. Maybe Andy wants to jump in here, because I have a sneaking suspicion the experiences there are similar.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, being patient-centric and focused is really about involving the patient for the entire process. From early on, designing the clinical program to what's meaningful to these patients. It's not just getting a product approved, it's got to be something that's meaningful to the patient. All the way through, when you've got this product that's meaningful, how are you going to get it to the patient and make sure that it's available to the patient? So that's really what's most important involving and being patient-centric, is throughout the entire process, not just after the drug is approved, or not just in the clinical side and then forgetting about the patient. You got to get the product to the patient still. I don't know if this is, fits so much with this question, but in the US, they've started to, as more and more rare diseases are being developed, they're developing products for them. There's these patient-focused drug delivery meetings.
Drug development meetings, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's a horribly named thing, ELPFDD, which is an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. But it's a brilliant idea in the sense that while it's spirited and usually brought to FDA's attention by whether it be industry or, more important, advocacy, it's a meeting that's really held for the regulatory authorities to understand and join this patient journey as well, because they don't have experience. If they've never reviewed a product for a rare disease, they don't know what that patient's journey is like. They don't know what's meaningful. And so in IgA nephropathy, they had one last summer, which was great. It was great for industry as well. We sat there and you could listen to exactly what the patients were going through, their struggles. And FDA had 10 people, 10 representatives there. And at the end of the meeting, the deputy commissioner of this division of the FDA stood up and she expressed, we heard you loud and clear on what's meaningful and what's important to you to get a drug approved. So I think it's becoming more and more accepted and the norm to involve patients. But once again, I think a key is along the entire continuum of the process from inception through post-approval is involving patients.
Thank you. Emily, I think you had a comment about this last point.
Yeah, I think it's really important for industry. Thank you, Ron. I think it's really important for industry to work with the patient advocacy groups on this. So I just wanted to share a brief anecdote. My co-founder, Alex Johnson, and I helped to co-fund a meeting looking at outcome measures in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And one of the outcome measures used in clinical trials are muscle biopsies. And these are incredibly invasive and very distressing to the children and the parents. And they're talking about, they take out big strips of muscle. But because patients are so desperate to get onto clinical trials and there aren't that many places available, they don't share their concerns with the consultants. So when Alex and I raised this at the meeting, everybody was completely taken aback that patients found muscle biopsies invasive. So we then partnered with a US company called Solid Biosciences, and we're currently funding a biomarkers project with them in Duke University to look at using urine as an outcome measure rather than these invasive muscle biopsies. And I think that's a really compelling case for putting the patient voice at the heart of drug development, finding out something that really doesn't help and trying to replace it with something that is, less onerous.
Thank you. Charlie, would you like to comment on the last point as well, or from maybe from a Congenica perspective? What it means to be patient focused for a company.
Yes, of course. So of course we're not working with patients currently in the same way as pharma are, but certainly a patient is put through our system to try and identify something that might explain the cause of the rare disease, and a report is generated which the clinician can read. Now, bearing in mind, the clinician isn't the last person who's going to see that. The patient could then request that report. So we have to very much bear in mind that we're not just generating loads of gibberish, lots of sort of scientific terms and clinical terms, which are essentially meaningless to sort of just a handful of people. So this is quite clear after speaking with clinicians and patients, the sorts of things that they would want to know about from a genome analysis. And that's very much guided the way we generate our reports. I think also, if if we make something that's really, really beneficial to the patient, it means it's going to be a popular thing for people to use. So ultimately, it's the patient who we have to consider, and their input into that is essential. But if I just come back to what it means to be a patient involved with sort of business, and I'm going to go back to 100,000 genomes again here. When we had one of our first meetings with the 100,000 genomes, just to say that both my children have gone through genome studies, and unfortunately we haven't found anything yet. But one of the first meetings we had was, we sat down, we were discussing about 100,000 genomes, sorts of things that we thought would be really useful. And a couple of us put our hands up and said, well, that's all really great. That sounds fascinating. But what I want to know is, where is my sample in your pipeline? And they couldn't say. I mean, someone would know. And they said, well, that's a really interesting point. So they then set about devising this sort of track my system, like a DHL, a Yodel, whatever it is, to know exactly where your sample is. Now, that didn't mean that you were going to get your sample or your analysis back any quicker, but it meant that some of those people who had already experienced their samples going missing in previous studies or many years ago were placated, because they knew that instead of their sample sitting in a fridge somewhere, their sample, they could log into a website and see exactly whereabouts their DNA was in the process. And that, I think, was an absolutely fundamental part of the success of how things are going now.
Okay, thank you. I have so many questions left, and we are starting to run out of time, and I see quite a few audience questions. So let me give you one more of my questions, which I'll ask you all to answer briefly, although you will want to answer at length. But the question, all of you mentioned the word disconnect in one way or another. in both now and in our conversations previously. Can you talk for 1 minute about what this disconnect is now and how it can be made better? Lachlan, can we start with you? Disconnect, I mean, between companies, clinicians, patients, that triangle.
I think in particular, you lose a human element. As soon as you sit across the table from either a patient or a physician, there's somehow you are the industry, and that's how you are viewed, rather than somebody having a conversation about trying to develop a treatment. To be fair, the industry has worked really hard to earn a terrible reputation on many, many fronts, and I will not be a champion for it in that regard. But I think there is a need in terms of that disconnect to recognize that you're talking with a person across the table, and that person is keen to help you, whether it's us as industry talking to a patient or to a physician, or the conversation coming back across the other way. Using labels doesn't necessarily help, particularly when you've got people who do wear multiple hats. And so just approaching it from a problem definition perspective, rather than you are representing this particular element in the room, I think is the most useful.
Thank you. Andy, could we hear from you about the disconnect and what can be done?
I think, talked a little bit earlier about this disconnect between patient, physician is that's the only perspective I would have, obviously, meaning speaking to the patient and seeing what's meaningful to them, and asking the same questions to physicians, and sometimes hearing a little bit difference. I think what it comes down to is once again, it's asking the right questions, it's listening, it's understanding that not every perspective is exactly the same, and not everybody has the same experience. Even if you have the same rare disease, you might not have the same exact experiences as everybody else. And so it's understanding that, I think, is something that I found that's pretty important. And when you involve the patient in that discussion, and multiple patients, I think you get different perspectives of what's meaningful to them compared to whoever's across the table.
Thank you. Emily, can we hear from you about the disconnect?
It's quite a big topic to cover. I think patient organisations need to become a bit more sophisticated about where they feel the patient voice is not being heard. I think patient organisations and patients need to be much more aware of issues like how their data is being used, and I'm really pleased to hear about the Patient Voice in the Human Genome Project. Registries need to be have the patient experience, patient voice, patient representative front and centre. Pharma, I think, could be more, could when you're having when they're developing clinical trial protocols where they speak to the principal investigator, they also need to include the patient voice right from the beginning, analysing and giving feedback on their protocols. And I keep coming back to this point, but when I went to the FDA a few years ago to give evidence at an AdCom, one of the panelists said to me, "Don't bring me a room full of crying mothers, bring me data." And I think that's what Project Hercules has done. It's turned tears into facts and numbers that can be used by HTA. And I think, that's really good advice. The passion and the emotion of the patient experience should not be relied upon for desperate last-minute access needs. It should be harnessed and used in a really professional, coherent way from the beginning. And if people can think a bit outside the box and truly collaborate, then I don't think that's impossible.
Thank you. Charlie, can we hear from you?
So I'm going to talk specifically about what I consider to be genomic medicine and the impact, of course, that DNA sequencing can have. I would have this is what I've done for my career, and therefore I'm going to be heavily biased towards what I believe it promises. Saying that, though, it does factually promise, it factually does produce great results. But what I know is a particular problem I see is that there are still many clinicians who are not convinced that getting a genomic diagnosis is of any use, because they say, well, that doesn't change anything, it doesn't make you better. And that's frankly, that's just wrong. There are a limited number of cases where therapy can be guided by your genome. But frankly, that's only one of the parts that a diagnosis can bring. And this is what I'm talking about, the disconnect between genomic medicine and current clinical practice. Is that, a diagnosis for your rare disease can bring about all sorts of benefits, maybe access to specific services. It might be that it helps on family planning for another child. It may even be that it gives some sort of psychological closure. It's a bit of a relief to a parent that perhaps the disorder that their child has is not a result of something they did during birth. I mean, there are many other examples of that sort of thing. But I also think there's quite a big disconnect between pharma and genomic and the use of genomics, because I believe that around 2003, when the human genome was finished, we'd promised pharma a huge amount. Everything will be solved by looking at your DNA, and frankly, that was just not true. It just didn't materialize. So I think pharma probably thought, well, okay, you promised, but nothing's materialized. But I do now believe that DNA sequencing and genome analysis has come on such a long way that really there is a great promise now between sort of understanding a patient's genome and the advances that it can help bring to pharma. So I would hope in the future, the very near future, that pharma and DNA sequencing companies will be able to work much more closely.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie. And thank you, all of you. I have so many more questions I'd like to ask you. And we should have finished now, but we started with a bit of a delay. So we'll roll that delay forward and maybe take one audience question. Should products be developed to address a patient's quality of life only, even if it has no medical impact? And how can this be funded, if so? It's a question from the audience. Can I hear maybe very briefly from those of you who would like to answer? Whether quality of life only has value and how it can be funded.
Yes. Who funds it is a tricky question. I mean, we're working on a very exciting project right now with WizKids, the leading disability wheelchair provider charity in the UK, to develop a type of wheelchair that is actually fit for the 21st century. Because believe it or not, apart from the very top of the range wheelchairs, the sort of average one that you get from the NHS, hasn't improved in 25 years.
Absolutely.
Did I think that's what I'd be doing when my son was diagnosed with a fatal disease? No, I didn't. I thought I'd be getting onto a gene therapy trial and funding that. Well, I funded the trial. He's not on a trial, but drug development is hard, and we need to be realistic. And I think anything we can do to improve patient quality of life would be fundamental. And maybe that's another area where we can get greater connection, where pharma could potentially fund projects like that won't necessarily make money, but that could rapidly improve project quality of life while we wait for treatment.
I'll just make one comment. I think that's important on that. Downstream a little bit further is who's going to pay for it, meaning insurers, and that's, as someone, when you're commercializing a product, you try to make meaningful, and that's where you try to involve the patient. It would be vital to have the patient in those meetings to define how valuable this quality of life is and what it is and how important it is, because unfortunately they're always looking for reasons not to cover certain medications and therapies. When we're in speaking with them, they look at it from dollars and cents, meaning a payer or insurer, and we often would hear quality of life is not as strong an endpoint for them to cover and pay for, unfortunately.
Thank you. All right. Would anyone else like to say something about this point?
I think, just as a quick comment, of course we should be developing products that focus on quality of life. I mean, why else do what we do? Yes, you need to treat the disease where you can. Certainly you need to cure the disease where you can, but where you can make advances for patients, you should be trying. You shouldn't just give up because it's just a focus on quality of life. I agree with Andy. The challenge is how do you fund that? But there's real value to quality of life for a patient.
I'll just add that I think in the field of genomics, we really are still at the beginning of how we can apply it in the clinic. And many cases there will be many cases where nothing will change for the patient, really, despite what I've said. But that really, we have to look into the future. These are the first steps of how we're going to be able to develop drugs based upon the genotype. So even if there's not much quality of life difference for some of these patients we're looking at, in 15, 20 years' time, maybe these initial steps we're taking today will be the huge steps of the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for your time and for your contribution, and I'd like to thank One Nucleus for hosting us here and for giving us a platform. What we said here was all generally about rare disease examples, but these problems are general, and actually the only reason is that rare disease has started this process earlier than others. So I hope there's a lesson in this to everyone to learn, and I'd like to thank you all for your the audience for attending. Thank you very much.